I'm Redbord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. Today, I sit down with Seth Wilks of the IRS. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. Recently, the FBI and the Department of Justice announced charges against 18 individuals and entities for their involvement in a pump and dump scheme. The investigation led to over $25 million in asset seizures and the deactivation of several trading bots responsible for wash trades. But the most interesting part of the investigation is that the FBI developed its own crypto token offering, Next Fund AI, as part of what the FBI called Operation Token Mirrors, to infiltrate and observe the inner workings of crypto market manipulation. To carry out the Next Fund AI sting operation, the FBI and DOJ set up a full infrastructure for their token, creating a seemingly legitimate project on Ethereum. Next Fund AI was publicly marketed as a security token to attract criminal groups who might exploit its perceived value. Investigators designed the token to mimic an attractive investment, allowing them to watch for fraudulent trading patterns. By embedding the coin within the trading ecosystem, the FBI could monitor market makers and traders who would potentially manipulate its market price through wash trading and pump and dump schemes. The FBI kept control of most of the token supply, making it appear desirable in the market while holding back enough to limit accessibility. This bait enabled agents to track token transfers, observe suspicious trading patterns, and identify actors who engaged in deceptive trading. Market makers connected with the operation used wash trading, a practice involving repeatedly buying and selling a token to inflate its perceived market activity artificially. The illusion of high trade activity made Next Fund AI seem popular, drawing additional unsuspecting investors. The FBI could monitor this pattern in real time due to their privileged access as the token's creator. Once the market activity around Next Fund AI was artificially inflated, certain traders were promoted to unsuspecting buyers before abruptly selling off large amounts of the token. This tactic drove up the token's price only to let it crash, allowing manipulators to cash in at the expense of regular investors. The FBI's role in creating the token meant it could document every step, gathering substantial evidence of these tactics. By positioning Next Fund AI as an investigative tool, the FBI worked with the SEC to charge and seize assets from individuals and firms involved in the schemes. The operation also led to direct arrests and asset seizures exceeding $25 million, with charges against 18 people and firms who were allegedly manipulating the crypto market. We talk all the time about the use of blockchain technology, blockchain intelligence by law enforcement, using the technology to better investigate fraud and financial crime. This is the ultimate example of that. The FBI leaning into the space in a way to create its own platform to essentially lure bad actors to try to exploit this token offering. Think of it as the Trojan horse for the digital age. We're likely to see lots more activity like this from the FBI and other global law enforcement. Now, let's sit down with Seth Wilks. Today, I am psyched to be joined by IRS crypto lead, Seth Wilks. Seth is the executive director of the Digital Asset Strategy and Development in the Office of Digital Asset Initiative at the Internal Revenue Service. Seth, welcome to TRM Talks. I've been wanting to do this for a while and just really excited to have you on.
Thanks, Harry. Super excited to be here today.
Before we kind of kick things off, you have a really cool collection of guitars hanging on a wall behind you? Do you play? Do you collect? What's the story?
Yeah, so music has been a big part of my life pretty much from the beginning. I come from a musical family, and I really picked up the guitar when I was about 12, and ever since through junior high, high school, even through college, I played in bands, done a lot of studio sessions in the past, and so it was really kind of like a dream come true. And I know we'll talk a little bit about the career path in a little bit, but I actually ended up working for Fender guitars for about 6.5 years. And so it was kind of like a dream, like I'm a CPA, I'm a nerdy accounting guy, but the truth is I wanted to be a rock star for most of my life. And so getting to like work at a company where like I'm surrounded by guitars and music, and I'm like, randomly Eddie Van Halen would walk past my office. I mean, it was a dream come true, to kind of marry up my passions along with my education and professionalism.
That's the coolest thing I've ever heard. So when you were in high school or even younger, were you playing in bands or like what were you doing there?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna date myself because let's see, 90s, I was in a ska band. So we had a whole horn section and everything, and
Just for our listeners, I'm jumping up and down right now.
but no, I loved it. I mean, music has always been. It's actually, I've kind of always thought that like it's such a wonderful creative outlet that it helps balance like all of the analytical stuff that I do in my life, and it's like it's a creates this just nice balance.
Did you play clubs? Did you play for friends? Like what was the vibe typically?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a small town in northern Utah, so there weren't exactly very many clubs. I'm pretty sure that we managed to get into a few bars underage to play, while we were growing up. But that in college there were quite a few venues that we got to play that were just really fun. And then after, while I was working at Fender, we ended up doing a lot of shows. I was working in Scottsdale, Arizona at the time, and so a lot of really great places to play down there, and lots of college kids. And so, yeah, it was always a lot of fun playing live.
That's awesome. You mentioned ska. Like, did things sort of progress? Like, what ultimately, like, if I had to define your style today, you jump on the guitar. What are you playing?
Honestly, it is probably like folk and Americana. So it's like very acoustic driven, very laid back. I think people would call it dad rock. So,
Oh, that's amazing. A little Springsteen, maybe every once in a while. I'm a Jersey
oh,
guy.
of course.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
definitely.
definitely.
Look, you mentioned the background. You mentioned Fender. Would you talk about your journey?
Yeah, so I'll go way back, even before I got into like, accounting and stuff, because I'm the youngest of 7 kids in my family. And I have a couple older brothers who actually ended up going into accounting as well. I had one brother, my brother Jeff, he got his PhD in accounting, is a professor at BYU. My brother who's in between us, my brother Jared, who ended up going more of like the finance, and he ended up working at a lot of startups. And I ended up going the tax route, because I didn't want to be exactly like, my brothers, but we're a lot alike. What was interesting though is that I always looked up to my brothers, like, and especially, my middle brother, he ended up getting into like the tech startup world really early. And, he went through several, a couple of successful exits. And I always looked at that. I was like, man, that would be so cool to be able to get involved in that. But the problem is most startups don't need tax people. I mean, most startups are running losses, and, tax is kind of like they're looking forward to when they need to pay taxes, right? And it's down the road. And so there wasn't really much of an opportunity for me. So, I ended up doing, some very traditional paths, start out my career with EY. I only lasted about 2 years because, big four accounting is kind of wild and crazy. And ended up going to Fender, which that was probably one of the most exciting times of my career, because I was only about 2 years out of school. And my boss who hired me, he's just like, look, you're probably more junior than I want, but you play guitar, and like, I'm going to take a chance on you. And it was amazing. And within a year, he ended up leaving to take another job, and he talked the CFO into giving me his role. So I'm now 3 years out of school running a global tax department for a multinational corporation. And it's like swimming in the deep end. And what I loved about it though is that I just had to dive in, and I had to like figure out what it is I knew, and then really quickly identify what I didn't know. And I kind of look back on that time very much like when I got into crypto, because it's like, man, there's so much that I don't know, that I don't understand. And I was just like constantly drinking from a fire hose. But like that feeling of just being able to learn and like just being immersed in new things all the time, it's invigorating. And so, that I spent my time at Fender learning a lot about international taxation, cross-border transactions. Then I ended up going over to PF Chang's, because once I had all my guitars, I was like, man, I could really use some Asian
Chinese food. I think it's so cool. I think people don't realize necessarily when you're building a business, whether it's guitars or Chinese food or blockchain intelligence, right? Like you need tax experts. It's so cool that you're going to these very disparate businesses.
Yes, I mean, from global manufacturing to hospitality. And one of the things I always loved about like the companies that I chose to work for is that I really loved their brands. I loved what they did. I mean, clearly I have a connection to guitars. So Fender, is one of the most iconic brands in the world. PF Chang's incredible food, incredible reputation. And then, I ended up going to a company called Black Diamond, which, they do backcountry skiing, hiking, climbing, rappelling activities. And, I was really just passionate about that. But then about 2018, I kind of talked about my brother who was in the tech startup world. He comes to me, he's like, hey, I heard about a company that's going to do this like tax crypto thing, and you should go talk to him. And I was like, okay, I know next to nothing about crypto, but let's go have a conversation. And so I ended up, meeting, a founder of this company, and I got intrigued. So for the next 6 months, I just deep dive into crypto and tax issues, and frankly realized that there weren't a whole lot of people who were engaging from a policy perspective. And so there was never a closed door when I wanted to go have a conversation with somebody, whether it was somebody on Capitol Hill or somebody in one of the agencies. And so I ended up joining this startup, and it was really, amazing getting exposure to all this. Now, just like many startups, this particular startup that I joined kind of crashed and burned, but it did set me up really well to then join TaxBit, which is where I worked for the 4 years prior to joining the IRS. And, it was amazing being able to take the relationships that I had built over my career and bringing in kind of that network into, a startup that was like, frankly, kind of doing everything right. They were hiring the right people. They were focusing very much on product and engineering. And it was exciting to be able to join, frankly, 2020, 2021, when just crypto was just going wild. Right. And it was, it was an incredible experience. And so, Ari, like when you work for a startup, you wear so many hats. Right. And, I came in initially to be, lead the subject matter expert team, but we needed somebody to focus on product. And so I leaned into product. And then we needed somebody to focus on implementations. And so, well, guess what? All of a sudden I'm like helping with implementations. And, and by the time I left, I was running policy for the company and leading a public sector team. And it was just like when I was young and at Fender, when I was just constantly being exposed to all of these new things. Like that's what crypto has been for me. It's like there's never a dull day because every day is completely different.
I love that narrative so much. Yeah, you're talking to a guy who was hired as head of legal and now hosts a podcast. So it's like it's so cool to be able to do all these different things and to really build something. You went to a startup, you spent a lot of time in the private sector, you developed expertise there, and then you took that to the government, which I love. And I think there needs to be much more of that, right? Folks in the private sector bringing that expertise into the federal government. Talk to me a little bit about that. Why leave this startup that's doing everything right, for this opportunity at IRS to lead much of the digital assets work?
Yeah, so I think really it kind of started back in 2018. So as I was kind of evaluating whether I wanted to kind of leave my very traditional career and get into crypto, I made 2 phone calls. And one of them was to a partner at an accounting firm who was kind of the godfather of crypto taxes. And the other one was a cold call to some random guy that I networked into at the IRS. And I was just really kind of curious, like, well, what are you guys thinking about? And we ended up just hitting it off. Like we, developed a relationship where, he would hear something new and he would call me. He's like, what do you think about this? I'm like, oh yeah. And, we kind of share our perspectives. And then I get something from a client and I'd be like, wow, that looks a lot like this, but it's a little bit different. We'd be able to just, I'd call him and we just talk it through. I mean, it's all unofficial, like, nothing to be relied on from a legal perspective, but it did give me a lot of insight just into like how the service was thinking. And so most of my career in digital assets has been very closely tied to my relationship with the IRS. And I mentioned that I had helped build a public sector practice at TaxBit, and the IRS was the primary client. And so, over the last 3 years, I worked very closely with the team at the IRS, and I knew the talent that they had. I knew the challenges that they were facing. And when the opportunity came on to actually join the service, I wasn't really seriously thinking about it. I love my tech startup. I love like working in this space. But, after talking to several people and realizing that this really is kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity, I got really, really excited about it. And so went through the process. And actually, it's pretty funny. I know my friend Raj has been on the podcast with you. He's my co-director at the office. Raj and I have been friends since 2020. I think we met at the first virtual currency summit that the IRS hosted, just like literally the week before the world shut down, March 2020. And, we've been friends ever since then. It turned out we were the last two candidates for this role. And of course, he and I are talking. And I mean, we both were on a trip, separate trips to Paris the week before our final interviews. And we're having dinner. And, our partners were like more worried, more nervous about it than we were. But what happened was we ended up going and doing our final interviews. And, we would cross each other in the hall and we're just laughing and just super comfortable with each other. And finally, everybody's like, how do we make a decision? And ultimately, they're like, well, why do we only have to hire one of them? And so, in one of those rare fashions, the IRS actually did something very fast, and they came up with a path to be able to bring both of us on to co-lead the office. So it's been great. Like ultimately, I see regulation as an important step in the industry maturing. And I actually see regulation as like that next path to really growing the industry. And so while I loved my work that I was doing in the private sector, having an opportunity to leave some fingerprints on things that are going to be around for a really long time and really, I think, enhance, the maturity of this market, it was just too good to pass up.
I remember when both of you were hired, and I was really honestly taken back by really the creativity and the entrepreneurial spirit almost of like the biggest bureaucracy on this earth. So it was like this really kind of, extraordinary moment. And I love that you and Raj are getting to do it together. Talk a little bit about your role. Like, what is the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so we came in to lead the Office of Digital Assets, and we're a small, nimble office. I think there's 5 full-time IRS folks, and then Raj and I. And our goal is to really kind of be like a center of excellence or center of knowledge for the IRS. We don't sit in any of the specific business units. So like, small business, self-employed, or large business international. We actually sit, to the side of them because digital assets touches every part of the IRS. And so it didn't make sense, I think, to have us embedded in one of the business divisions. It made sense to kind of put us to the side where we can work with all of them. And so really, I think if we had to narrow it down, we really need to focus on regulation, training our employees so that they are up to speed on the technology, and then also technology, like making sure that they have the right tools in their hands. What I've really come to realize, and I don't know if I fully appreciated this coming into it, is that I feel like the true mission that we have set forth right now is really to enhance voluntary compliance. Like at the end of the day, we have 2 functions that we really are responsible for. One is compliance and one is enforcement. And enforcement takes a lot more effort, resources, human capital. It's time intensive, and it's just not going to be effective at scale, right? What we have here in the US is a voluntary tax system. And anything that we can do to enhance that capability or the ability for taxpayers to understand their obligations is going to be far more effective than us throwing tons of dollars into any kind of enforcement efforts. And so on day one, our first priority was really the broker regulations. And so these are, think 1099s, right? These are basically, when you're buying and selling and you have a taxable disposal, typically you're getting a 1099 from, if you're selling stocks, you're getting a 1099B from your broker. And that has all the information you need to, then take that and either plug it into, your tax software or hand it over to your CPA. And for us, what we realize is that as taxpayers, we're so used to getting 1099s and we almost equate it into like, oh, I have a 1099, therefore I need to report this. And then the opposite is also true where, oh, I didn't get a 1099. Maybe I don't need to report this. People have kind of become conditioned to think that's how it works. So a big part of wanting to get the broker rules out there is so that we can get better information in the hands of taxpayers so that they understand like what their obligation is. And, it also doesn't hurt that they know that we have, we as the IRS are holding the other copy of that 1099.
That's really helpful context. You mentioned the broker rules. I know most of our listeners are pretty deep in this space, but for those who don't remember, a couple of years ago, the Biden administration, which really a signature bill, put out their infrastructure bill. And within that huge bill, there was essentially a tax reporting obligation for cryptocurrency businesses. And it came down to the definition of broker. And that really was sort of the issue, is what is a broker? And the industry had a lot of views on whether DeFi was or was not a broker, certain DeFi services, whether various validators and other types of services or entities that were not clear crypto exchanges. So it became a huge issue. Since then, there have been a lot of big issues, but really it was the biggest issue and maybe the first really big issue, maybe the second, unhosted wallets or something like this from the Treasury Department. But there were a lot of huge issues at the time. Where did you guys ultimately land on all of this?
Our proposed rule that we issued back in 2023 really covered everything. So it was covering custodial and non-custodial, the DeFi space. It was very expansive. And I think through the process of getting all the comments, we realized that we need to break it up. Trying to take on all of these topics at once was very complicated. And so, we kind of landed on, well, let's look at custodial brokers first, because, frankly, the custodial brokers look a lot like the TradFi brokers. They custody your assets for you. They enable you to, trade on their platform. And, there was a lot of things that we could look at, analogies in the TradFi sector that we could apply to crypto exchanges and whatnot. And really, it came down to realizing that if we split it into two, you've got custodial brokers and then you've got non-custodial brokers. And the custodial brokers just frankly had a different starting point than the non-custodial. Like, many of these centralized exchanges have been doing, KYC and AML. They've got systems in place. They've got teams in place to do a lot of this. And so moving and maturing into a tax reporting regime is a much easier ask than, say, an area that has never had any reporting. And DeFi is a different beast, like who within the tech stack might be a broker. And so, we just felt like it was much easier to get to the custodians first. And frankly, most of the transaction volume is still happening on the custodial brokers. And so, we felt like, we're able to get to most taxpayers that way as well. Because again, our goal is to enhance compliance, not to use this as a way to, expand our enforcement bucket. We actually want to decrease our enforcement bucket because right now we don't have 1099s. We don't have third-party validation. And so we really don't know who is ultimately in compliance or who isn't, which, as you can imagine, makes that enforcement bucket look really big. We're now working on the non-custodial brokers, and Treasury has spoken publicly that we're likely to have those regs out by the end of the year. It's been a lot of education. It's been us sitting down with a lot of folks in the industry to understand the tech stack. And, I think that we're getting to the place that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure it will be controversial because there's always controversy when, you're trying to decide where a broker lies, and there's multiple who could potentially fit that bill. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, I think we'll have an exciting end of the year.
Yeah. Is that really the biggest challenge here, working with industry to parse out, like, where does the broker live within these tech stacks?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the biggest comments that we got is like, based on our proposed rules was like, man, everybody in the tech stack could be a broker. And, I don't think that that was our intention, of course. But also, I think that, and again, I wasn't here when we wrote the proposed rules, and so I'm speculating a little bit. But I also think sometimes when you issue a proposed rule, you go broad on purpose so that you can get good comment letters to tell you, like, hey, this is really how it is, and this is how you should be thinking about it. And so, I think trying to figure out who is performing services that appear like brokers versus those who are performing services that are like validating transactions on the blockchain and, creating new blocks and that kind of thing.
Look, I don't know what the reaction from the industry is going to be on the sort of non-custodial work that you guys are doing, but I could say it was very positive on the custodial piece, on the rule that actually came out. And I think in large part because you were working with industry and you got to this place where I think most of industry is today, and that is that exchanges are essentially like financial institutions and have the infrastructure to do this type of reporting. In our world at TRM, it's the same on the AML side, right? There's an understanding that cryptocurrency exchanges, right? Binance, Coinbase, Kraken, Gemini, all have anti-money laundering obligations. It's easy to put tax reporting obligations on those guys. This other stuff is going to get a lot more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you're running the podcast and asking questions, but I'll ask a question back to you. How are you guys engaging in the DeFi space? Back when I was in the private sector, people were thinking about, broker reporting, within the DeFi space. So from an AML perspective, because I think those issues seem like those have come up earlier, right? Obviously, unfortunately, crypto has had a little bit of a reputation, even though I think it's not fully warranted, but it has had a reputation for being, a vehicle for money laundering and that kind of thing. And so I think that topic has come up. So how have you guys engaged in that space?
Look, I think that one of the reasons, look, I'm not a tax lawyer. I don't even try to play one on TV. But on the AML piece, and I think there are a lot, like what I've learned is there are a lot of really interesting parallels. And, we work with the leading DeFi protocols today, Uniswap, Aave, 1inch, to do sanction screening and anti-money laundering on their front end, right? The most centralized part of a DeFi protocol. I think the challenge becomes, how do we do this at the protocol layer, which is what you guys are dealing with when it's like truly decentralized software. And that becomes a lot more complicated. I do believe that there's going to be technology solutions to that. Regulators roll their eyes, so please don't roll your eyes at me when I talk about a future state where we have digital ID and zero knowledge proofs are being used, where we're building anti-money laundering at the protocol layer. I think that's all coming. It's just not necessarily built and developed today. So I think I land ultimately where you did, which again, like it's so cool to see the parallels. And that is like, look, you still need on and off ramps, in crypto today, because for the most part, you're not buying things in cryptocurrency. So you need to convert fiat into crypto, move it around. Maybe you want to put it in DeFi, maybe you want to stake, do whatever you're going to do. But ultimately, you still need to find that off ramp. And if we can properly regulate those on and off ramps, the exchanges, then we're probably hitting a lot of the activity. And it sounds like that's kind of where you guys landed, at least in the first iteration of the broker rule to a large extent.
Well, yeah, 100%. I mean, I absolutely can confirm. I mean, it made sense for us because, again, I kind of talk about the starting line. Centralized brokers, they were starting from a much different place than the DeFi, potential DeFi brokers, right? And so it just made sense to focus over there. Ultimately, though, I think that what I've really appreciated, and frankly, we're talking to folks like you and a lot of the policy folks in the industry is, I think all of us recognize that regulation is coming no matter what. You can never have a fully unregulated financial system. Like it's just not likely to happen, right? And I think that for the people who can accept that regulations are coming, it's much easier to then start talking about, well, what makes sense rather than should we have any, right? I truly believe that like regulation brings clarity and clarity brings big players to the field.
Could not agree more. I think that's what I'm most excited about is like when we hear about, the potential over the next year or so to pass comprehensive, market structure. I think it's great to have. Talk to me about like, what are the other issues that you guys are grappling with outside the broker rule?
A lot of what we do is we think, kind of split the world into, we've got pre-reg, which is kind of the world that we live in right now, and then post-regulation. And that's really when 1099 reporting starts. With 1099 reporting, you have third-party information that you can validate against filed tax returns. And so, you have a very good idea who is in compliance and who is not. Right now, we don't have that third-party reporting. And so really, we have a lot less information to go off of. And so it really has been relying on our enforcement efforts. And those enforcement tools that we've had were John Doe summonses. But again, like those are limited, that only touches a small portion. And so for us to be able to really have a comprehensive compliance program, that third-party information is like so critical. And so I think that we would much rather move away from that because, John Doe summonses, it's a ton of resources on our side. We have to work with DOJ. It's a ton of resources on the exchanges side. Like they're hard to manage, like you end up in court. So having, again, clarity on regulation, which, for us is like getting the broker rules out, we can move away from John Doe summonses and start proactively using a set of rules that everybody understands they need to live by. And, it provides us with much better information, provides taxpayers with much better information as well. So I think pre-reg, we kind of have to stick with, some of our enforcement tools. But I think post-reg, once we have 1099 information available, it'll be a lot different world.
Fantastic. This is TRM Talks, so we got to do a little AML here. Talk to me about how you at IRS, obviously we work closely with your teams there. How do you think about anti-money laundering and like where does it play into sort of the overall IRS role in the world?
Yeah, so I am going to do the opposite of you. I'm definitely not an AML expert. But, the way I see these things, I mean, this is how we create integrity in our financial systems, right? We are trying to ensure that the good actors remain good actors and that we're able to detect the bad actors. And it really is a partnership between the public and private sector because, our IRS criminal investigations teams work very closely with the compliance teams at all of these the money service businesses, and they have tools like TRM to help them. And so I really think this has been an incredible example of how the public and private sector can come together to enhance the capabilities of detecting illicit finance and that kind of thing.
It's really extraordinary. I think people, anyone who listens to this show definitely knows about IRS CI because we talk about IRS criminal investigation a lot. We've had Jared Koopman on, Chris Jencheski at TRM, longtime IRS agent. But people don't realize they're doing sort of, tax evasion cases, but tax evasion is in every case.
I mean, as you know, IRSCI has been involved in crypto almost from the beginning. I think that our agency was probably one of the most proactive agencies of like leaning in. Like one of my teammates, Gary Alford, he was one of the key investigators on Silk Road. Like they're one of the first major darknet marketplaces that use crypto as a form of payment. And so that knowledge has been being built up for over a long time. I'll be honest, one of the challenges though that we face is that a lot of the folks who have been building that knowledge, they are moving to the private sector, which I get it. And I think that the companies who are hiring them are better for it. Fortunately, I think in your space specifically, I mean, because it is such a partnership between the public and private sector, like it makes a lot of sense, but it's a challenge for us to be able to continue to keep growing, our knowledge base and, our investigators and keeping that knowledge in-house as long as we can.
I see, the expertise growing. I think we see more and more agents and investigators who are wanting to sort of understand how to use these tools, how to sort of gain the expertise. Seth, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks.
Thanks, Harry. Really great being here.
I think Seth really makes these issues, which are complicated, right? Sort of the most esoteric issues in tax law, right? How to treat crypto assets, essentially, how to deal with DeFi, how to deal with, non-custodial services. He makes it accessible, which is so cool. And now having heard from Max, Bern from TaxBit, having heard from Raj, also from IRS, even Jared Koopman from IRS CI, we've gotten this perspective that tax law can be accessible. And I think TRM Talks has really leaned into bringing on tax expertise because, as I've said before, I am not a tax expert. I do not play one on TV. To me, the coolest part of the conversation was definitely Seth being willing to talk a bit about what potentially could be coming when it comes to non-custodial services, right? We now know what the regs are for custodial brokers, cryptocurrency exchanges, essentially. But there's been this preview of essentially what's coming for DeFi. I think it'll be really interesting to see if that ultimately comes, just given the change of administrations. I've seen some sort of indication of maybe it's pens down for a lot of these regulatory agencies. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens over the course of the next few months. And then finally, I mean, how cool was the Fender stories? I can't think of you imagine the perfect job person fit. How cool does it have to be a tax expert who also is a guitar player working for Fender? There's so many fun takeaways from that conversation. And, when I think about TRM Talks, I think about, really educating people, providing subject matter expertise, but also having a lot of fun and getting to know people. And I feel like we really got to do that with Seth today. On the next TRM Talks, I sit down with Renee Michaud, Global Head of Digital Assets for Standard Chartered, and Esme Hudson, Chief Compliance Officer for SC Ventures. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it, and follow us on LinkedIn to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.